The United States supports dictatorships in the Middle East, not because it loves dictatorships, but because it loves control over oil.
40 out of 50 Muslim-majority countries in the world are authoritarian hellholes.
Jordan Peterson.
This is a former Harvard researcher. This is someone who worked at the University of Toronto.
A man obsessed with you tidying your room in one of his 12 bizarre rules, and was recently on Piers Morgan. In this particular episode, he was obsessing over Muslim grooming gangs, but also he was talking and spouting about Muslim history, and he didn't know what he was talking about. Surprise! Let's be absolutely clear, the grooming and exploitation of vulnerable young girls by predatory gangs is abhorrent, inexcusable, and demands justice. I think it deserves a national inquiry, but I don't think it should just be specific to one group. I think it should be looking at what the monarchy does, what the church does, what local councils have done. It should be looked into across the whole of the UK, but I don't think it's going to happen, and there's a lot of historical evidence to show that it won't ever happen. Reducing this issue to one religion or race does a disservice to the victims and the truth. It ignores the systematic failures, the entrenched misogyny and power structures that allow these crimes to persist unchecked. Is Peterson's critique of Islam just another example of Western bias that has a huge history, or does it ignore the real common factor? Male-dominated violence. Something that is never brought up within this conversation. So we're going to break this down into 3 parts. In part 1, we're going to explore Peterson's comments and his understanding of history and how that ties into Western bias against Islam. Part 2, we're going to examine Christian atrocities, systemic abuse, and the hypocrisy at the heart of this narrative. And in part 3, we're going to discuss Peterson's logical contradictions and his broader issue of male violence.
There's another ugly issue here, Pierce, that no one will grapple with, which is, you described Robinson as anti-Muslim, let's say. Well, we don't really understand the relationship between the religious doctrine, let's say, and the fact of these crimes. Now, I want to make 2 cases here. The first case is that 40 out of 50 Muslim-majority countries in the world are authoritarian hellholes, and only 3 of them are democracies. And that's Morocco, Indonesia, and Turkey. And, they're not, I wouldn't put them in the highest echelons of stellar states. And so why is that exactly? Is that a deviation from Islamic principles, or is it a consequence of them? Now, no one wants to have that discussion, and it's no bloody wonder.
Or is it something he conveniently ignores? Is it the British Empire, the American Empire, and their obsession for oil and oil security that has got them to support and back dictators and kings in the Middle East over democracies?
In 1958, President Eisenhower asked his staff, "Why is there a campaign of hatred against the U.S. among the people of the Middle East?" The National Security Council provided an answer.
The people in the Middle East's perception is that the United States supports brutal tyrannies, blocks democracy and development, and does so because we want control of their oil.
The National Security Council went on to say,
The perception's more or less correct, and that's the way it ought to be.
It's actually been an open secret for decades, but for the first time now, the CIA has released documents that show its role in the 1953 coup. That is the coup that toppled Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister. Mohammad Mossadegh had moved to nationalize oil production in Iran. Well, the U.S. was concerned at the time that that would mean a victory for the Soviets in the Cold War. So shortly after his election, the CIA began to plan his overthrow, teaming up with Britain's MI6.
Now, you go, well, why don't they just do what they did in 1906 and overthrow the democracy? They can't, because before Mossadegh nationalizes the oil company and basically throws the British out, before he did that, he actually expelled the British embassy. He said, you know what, get out. And the reason he did this is because he knew that the overthrow of the Iranian democracy was launched by British embassy staff. So if he can get rid of the British embassy, he neutralizes Great Britain's ability to overthrow his democracy. So he expels them, and then he nationalizes the oil company. The British are stunned by the 1950 nationalization of their oil company. They can't believe it. They put all this foreign policy effort into securing Iranian oil for themselves, and in an instant they lose it all because of democracy. How inconvenient.
So when exactly did that relationship start with Iraq?
It probably actually, the CIA-Saddam Hussein relationship probably started in the 60s. The Baathists in Iraq managed to gain power, and Saddam Hussein had already joined that party. And so briefly, he was actually part of the government in Iraq. And he was basically a thug for the party. He would actually commit crimes to generate capital to help fund the party's activities. So we liked him, and we were probably already well connected with him. So that in '76, when the Baathists take Iraq over again, we began immediately communicating with him to see if we can work with him. And we find out we can, because we give him a list of people we don't like in Iraq. We don't tell him what we want to have him do with those people. We just tell him, well, you know, we don't like these guys. They're a lot of them are scholars, a lot of them are activists, a lot of them just belong to political parties that we're not really keen on, like socialists. And he has them mass arrested. They do these big kangaroo courtroom hearings where they're trying 20, 50 defendants at a time. They're all found guilty, and then he has a mass hanged live in primetime TV across the country.
I'm just imagining some CIA guy just going like, how about that?
Yeah, okay, we can work with that guy.
Saddam Hussein sent out a communique to George Bush Sr., we surrender. George Bush Sr. said, no, too late. He sent out another communique to George Bush Sr., we surrender. Bush ignored it. He sent a communique to the Soviet Union, to Mikhail Gorbachev, and said, hey, we surrender. There's no point in fighting. We can't win. We surrender. Mikhail Gorbachev called up George Bush Sr. and said, on behalf of the Iraqi people, I'm offering a surrender. And Bush said, no, we're not taking it. No surrender. Saddam Hussein ordered the troops in Kuwait to run away as fast as they could. They confiscated every vehicle they could find, cars, buses, flatbed trucks, and they took off on the Basra highway from Kuwait. Thousands of soldiers, and we dropped incendiary bombs all across the highway and just burned them to death.
The Soviets are in there, they've already made the commitment, so let's just funnel aid to the Northern Alliance and then to the broader group called the Mujahideen, and just make the Soviets pay the price for kind of going into the wrong place at the wrong time.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. All the decades of deceit and cruelty have now reached an end. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
I mean, here's a list of all the interference starting from 1916, running from the British, the French and the Americans. But let's not forget, the Soviet Union were there as well, and this is up until the present day. There's been nothing but carnage taking place in the Middle East, and it's been a fight over oil. But of course, does Peterson mention any of that? No. And we'll get onto this as it goes on, because he does seem to know some history of the area, but it's almost as if he's choosing to ignore it.
You know, the fact that only 3 of 50 Muslim majority polities in the world, states, are democratic, even approximating democratic, it's like, what the hell are we to make of that exactly?
It's about oil and ideology. But he also stated that there's only 3 democracies. That's not true either. It's about 8 to 12, and it depends on your definition of what a democracy is, which can sound quite strange, but bear in mind, the UK has several bodies that are unelected, from the King to the House of Lords to the Supreme Court. So is that a democracy? So when you go over that list, you're starting to go Senegal, Tunisia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Albania, Kosovo, Morocco, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Iraq. It's almost mind-blowing that this guy has actually somehow managed to get a Harvard degree. But the stupidity does not end there. He starts raving and ranting about whether or not Arab countries, Muslim countries, should be allowed to have natural resources underneath their feet, and somehow seems to blame the West for the geographical circumstances these Arab states have landed themselves in by pure chance.
It's pretty bloody easy for the rich Muslim countries who are absolutely awash in, I would say, undeserved oil money to moralize about the superiority of their culture. I mean, the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia were a little, fringe tribal cult before the West stupidly dumped $1 trillion on them and allowed them to propagandize the entire world. They would have been a backwoods Arab tribe lost in the desert forever if it wasn't for oil money. We're unbelievably naive on that front now.
This is continual Islamophobia. It all actually shows that he has some knowledge of the history, and yet he's completely choosing to ignore the last 100 years of Western and Soviet influence on the Middle East and how it's damaged it. But then he seems to go really wackadoodle by suggesting that it was bad for someone to exploit the resources that are underneath them. But I've never heard him say that about or the UK or the United States. And bear in mind that those two countries have been involved in mass genocides over hundreds of years. But does Jordan talk about that? They've also been instigators or been connected to 2 world wars. And the stuff he's saying is insane imperialistic views. One being, if it's oil, it must be American. This is historian Rory Casagrande. Have a listen to what he says in a sarcastic tone, whereas Jordan Peterson was saying almost exactly the same, but he was saying it as if it was something to be said about the Middle East.
God put 60% of your oil under Arab feet. That suck. What was God thinking? I don't know how our oil got under their feet. So weird. Must flow or something. Surely it must have been here originally, because God loves us more than them. You know you've had this conversation with yourself before. Because you're just a bunch of religious fanatics like they are. You just hate them because when you look at their, and you hear their stuff, you go, oh my God, it's just like me, let's kill them so that I don't have to hear that anymore. It's true.
But if you think Peterson was done with his conspiracies and white nationalism and Muslim hate, you'd be wrong.
So 100% of Protestant or Catholic majority countries outside of Africa are highly functional democracies.
So this is interesting because he's actually not far off. If you don't include Cuba, then it is 100%. Then of course you have to ignore Orthodox Christianity, so Russia and Belarus are clearly authoritarian and have millions of Christians in them. Georgia, it's a little bit more debatable, but they're semi-democratic. But once again, he ignores history on purpose. So for example, Spain under Franco, dictatorship, Catholic majority. Portugal, dictatorship, Catholic majority. Poland, dictatorship, Catholic majority. You would also have to ignore the fact that Adolf Hitler was Catholic. You would also have to ignore the fact that a lot of Europe, just 90 years ago, Protestant and Catholic majorities, they were a dictatorship. And of course, if you go further back to World War I, just over 100 years ago, you'll find that the majority of those countries in Europe that were Protestant and Catholic were run as monarchies, some as a constitutional monarchy, with a small parliament with limited influence. And the main reason these monarchies came to an end is because they got greedy and they went to war, also known as World War I. That in front of you is the Kaiser, the King of Germany at the time, a Lutheran with strong connections to Protestantism. So during this period of British expansionism, American greatness and European growth, we also had some of the worst human atrocities carried out by Christians and Catholics. Then if you want to go on the direction of the biggest genocides in history, you've got the genocide of the Native Americans, which was estimated to be about 100 million. You've got the transatlantic slave trade, which was 12 to 15 million. You've got the Holocaust, which is estimated to be about 6 to 11 million. And guess who was involved in all three? Now, this is a taboo topic to bring up, and I didn't intend to until I heard him spouting absolute rubbish. When you have situations where you do not have a stable government and you have extreme poverty, the likelihood of getting extremism is increased, and that can be religious or ideological. And the thing that Peterson seems to completely completely ignore is the damage that has been done to the Middle East from the West over oil and ideology. And considering that horrific and extensive and centuries-long list of destruction, there's Peterson trying to turn around and suggest that this is just something anomalous with Muslims.
This is a scandal that hasn't gone away, that the cover-up has never been properly investigated, that people were never held properly accountable, that no one has gone to prison who was at any level of responsibility for trying to protect these girls. None of them were properly held to account.
No, I completely agree with that. What I find really stark and interesting that no one's talking about is that I could be using that description to describe what happened with Savile. I could be using that description to describe what happened with Epstein, who was trafficking people over to the UK, and that's not just with Andrew. That was with other people living here. But has anyone been arrested? Then you have this from the former Prime Minister.
One comment I would make is I think an awful lot of money, an awful lot of police time now goes into these historic offences and all this malarkey, and 60 million pounds I saw was being spaffed up the wall on some investigation into historic child abuse and all this kind of thing. I mean, what on earth is that going to do to protect the public now?
And then there's one of the most chilling stories I've ever heard involving Savile and Prince Philip, and no one has ever commented on it on mainstream media.
Very good fix it I did with a young lady at Buckingham Palace. I was at a reception at Buckingham Palace. That's the place where the Queen lives and Prince Philip.
I know, they keep the Queen there.
And it's not an easy gaff to penetrate. Very, very...
Wait a minute, what's that? Not an easy...
There's not an easy place to get into. That's
yes.
right.
Yeah.
So I was at this reception, and there was a very nice lady and gentleman said to me, "My daughter would be so pleased to know that I've met you and this, that and the other." And I said, "Oh yes. Where is she?" And they said, "She's in the back of the car." I said, "What, in the boat?" And they said, "No, we've sneaked her in the back of the car so she can say she's been in the palace courtyard." I said, "And you've got her stuck out there?" I said, "Oh, leave it to me." And they went, "No, please don't." Then they grabbed it and I said, "No." So I went to see a minder and said, "They've got this situation and I'm bringing a friend in." So I said, "Listen, who's going to object to you?" So I said, "All right." Now, the palace staff are the most excellent people, right? On the way out, I explained very briefly what I was going to leave it to us. So I went out into the car park, which is a courtyard inside the palace, and I shouted the young lady's name. Next minute, she's holding my arm, and next minute we're marching up the steps right into the palace. Well, the staff had done it right. The two footmen opened the two great doors, and inside there were all the majors and the colonels and the household staff. It's a most elegant situation and tremendously rewarding, right? And of course, when she sees this spectacle of the carpet and the people all standing there, and they all give a little graceful dip as she walked by, and she was now hanging onto me like a lifebelt, understand? Right? And we walked up the steps and into the room where the reception was, in a room called the ballroom, and fantastic, look. Prince Philip, who was a marvellous geezer, happened to be just standing inside the door, parroting to somebody. So I went...
It's a pre-arranged signal, no doubt.
Well, no, there's not a lot of people go psst inside the palace. People do him. So he's from the butchers, right, like this. See me, and I do the nod for the kiddo. So he doesn't know where this young lady's appeared from, with his long coat on and bumpy shoes, but he has given the beautiful smile, and she's gone, right? That was a fix-it that I really enjoyed, and I think she might remember it, even if her parents and herself are watching tonight, she might even remember it to this day, and I think a lot longer.
And this is unfortunately only the tip of the iceberg, because there is scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal involving children's homes. And there are allegations from some of the victims that they were picked up and sent to London and met with people who they would consider to be VIPs or MPs, including former Prime Minister Ted Heath, who police said in their report they would have pulled him in for questioning after the serious number of allegations put against him and the witness statements against him. Not only that, but there seems to be a high number of cases where files have gone missing. And despite all of that research that I've just shown you, someone with a Harvard degree and a degree and a doctorate in psychology, he hasn't done any research into any of this. And all he's got is this.
There's another ugly issue here, Pierce, that no one will grapple with, which is, you described Robinson as anti-Muslim, let's say. Well, we don't really understand the relationship between the religious doctrine, let's say, and the fact of these crimes.
To me, from what I can tell, the UK as a whole has a problem, and that is not being addressed. And I'll make a bet now that the government will not do a nationwide investigation across the board. They'll only target specific things to avoid anything being dug up about this. I think, personally, if I was to put a bet on it, there's a cover-up taking place, and there is a wider, more systemic problem that's never been addressed. But the one thing that does hold true and is extremely sad is that the majority of these crimes, the vast majority of these crimes, which no one will bring up, especially Jordan Peterson, is that this is all perpetrated by men. And Jordan Peterson's comments, as well as Tommy Robinson's comments, are just not factually correct. They perpetuate harmful stereotypes about Islam while ignoring the systemic issue of male violence. Abuse rings aren't a product of religion or culture, they're a product of unchecked power. If Peterson wanted to address this systemic abuse, let's have a conversation, but let's do it with honesty, not racism. What do you think? Is Peterson deliberately misrepresenting history? Is he stupid? Or is he just deliberately ignorant to push his own narrative? Put your thoughts in the comments. As usual, I'd like to say a big thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube subscribers. You keep this channel going and growing. If you'd like to help out, there's a link in the description. Otherwise, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps the channel. Once again, thanks for listening. Bye for now.